In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, where the sun burns hot and secrets run deeper than well water, a wealthy rancher's daughter thought she could buy any man's loyalty with her father's money. She was wrong. Dead wrong. What started as a simple business arrangement between a desperate woman and a mysterious cowboy became something neither of them saw coming. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is get exactly what you ask for. Because when pride meets passion on the unforgiving frontier, someone always pays the price. And, in this case, that price was a heart, a fortune, and a legacy that would change everything. This is the story of how Margaret Whitmore learned that some men can't be bought, only earned. And how Jake Sullivan discovered that sometimes the most valuable thing a person can give you isn't gold or land, but trust. In a world where a handshake means everything and betrayal can cost you your life, their story proves that love doesn't always come gentle. Sometimes it comes with spurs on. Margaret Whitmore stood at the window of her father's study, watching the dust clouds rise from the main road leading to their ranch. The Whitmore spread stretched as far as the eye could see, 30,000 acres of prime cattle land that had made her family one of the wealthiest in all of Texas. But, wealth, she had learned the hard way, couldn't solve every problem. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden floors as she turned away from the window, her green eyes settling on the stack of threatening letters piled high on her father's mahogany desk. Each one bore the seal of the bank in Dallas, and each one carried the same message written in different words. Pay up, or lose everything. Her father, Samuel Whitmore, had been dead for 3 months now. Heart attack, the doctor said, brought on by stress and too many cigars. Margaret knew better. The bank had killed him just as surely as if they had put a bullet in his chest. The loans he had taken out to expand the ranch during the drought years had come due, and the interest was bleeding them dry faster than a stuck pig. She picked up one of the letters, her hands trembling slightly as she read the familiar words again. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 60 days unless they could come up with $50,000. It might as well have been $50 million. The cattle market had crashed after the railroad disputes, and most of their herd was worth less than the cost of feeding them. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted her thoughts. Heavy steps, confident, belonging to someone who wasn't afraid to announce their presence. Margaret quickly stuffed the letters back into the desk drawer and smoothed down her dark blue dress, trying to compose herself before whoever it was reached the front door. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house. Margaret waited for Rosa, their housekeeper, to answer, but remembered she had sent the older Mexican woman to town for supplies. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Margaret walked through the spacious hallway, her boots clicking on the hardwood floors. The house felt too big, too empty without her father's booming voice filling the rooms. She paused at the heavy oak door, taking a deep breath before pulling it open. The man standing on her porch was not what she had expected. Tall and lean, with broad shoulders that filled out his worn leather vest, he had the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the open sky. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, touching the collar of his faded blue shirt, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds. A well-used hat sat tilted back on his head, and a gun belt hung low on his hips. "Miss Whitmore?" His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that placed his origins somewhere further south. "Yes, I'm Margaret Whitmore. What can I do for you, mister?" "Jake Sullivan." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite but not subservient. "I heard you might be in need of some help around here." Margaret studied his face, looking for signs of the pity she had grown tired of seeing in the eyes of their neighbors. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about the Whitmore family's troubles. News traveled fast in small towns, especially bad news. But this stranger's expression was neutral, businesslike. "What kind of help?" she asked carefully. "The kind that involves dealing with men who don't take no for an answer," Jake said. His eyes were steady on hers, and she noticed they held a hardness that made her believe he knew exactly what he was talking about. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. Word had gotten out then about the trouble they were having with Victor Caldwell and his men. Caldwell owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, and he had made it clear he intended to add the Whitmore spread to his holdings. When her father was alive, Caldwell had made reasonable offers. Since Samuel's death, his methods had become less civilized. I'm not sure I know what you mean, Margaret said, though they both knew she was lying. Jake glanced past her into the house, then back to her face. Mind if we talk inside? Some conversations are better had without an audience. Margaret hesitated. Inviting a stranger into her home went against everything her father had taught her about being careful. But there was something about Jake Sullivan that made her want to trust him. Maybe it was the way he looked her in the eye when he spoke, or the fact that he hadn't mentioned her father's debts or offered empty condolences like everyone else. She stepped back and gestured for him to enter. Jake removed his hat as he crossed the threshold, and Margaret noticed his hair was cleaner than she would have expected from a drifter. His clothes were worn but well-maintained, and his boots, while scuffed, had been recently polished. "Can I offer you some coffee?" Margaret asked, leading him toward the kitchen. "That would be appreciated, ma'am." The kitchen was Margaret's favorite room in the house. Large and airy, with windows that looked out over the vegetable garden her mother had planted before her death 10 years earlier. Margaret busied herself with the coffee pot, grateful for something to do with her hands while she tried to figure out what this man wanted from her. "You said you heard I might need help," she said as she measured out the coffee grounds. "Who told you that?" "Man named Charlie Torres, runs the livery stable in town. Says Victor Caldwell's been making himself at home on your land lately." Margaret's hand stilled. Charlie was one of the few people in town who had remained loyal to her family, but she hadn't realized he was talking to strangers about their business. "Charlie talks too much," she said. "Charlie's worried about you," Jake corrected. "Says your father was good to him when times were hard. He's returning the favor the only way he knows how." The coffee began to percolate, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. Margaret turned to face Jake, who had taken a seat at the wooden table without being invited. She should have been offended by his presumption, but instead found herself oddly comforted by his presence. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked directly. "Protection," Jake said simply. "Caldwell's been running roughshod over your property because he knows you're alone out here. Men like him respect only one thing." "And what's that?" "Someone who's willing to push back harder than they push." Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Jake, then took the chair across from him. "And you're willing to push back?" "For the right price, yes." There it was. Margaret felt a familiar disappointment settle in her chest. She should have known better than to think someone would help her out of kindness. Everyone wanted something. "How much?" she asked. Jake took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of the cup. $500. Margaret nearly choked on her own coffee. $500? "Mr. Sullivan, I'm afraid you've been misinformed about my family's current financial situation." "I know exactly what your situation is, Miss Whitmore. Your father borrowed heavily to expand during the drought years. The loans are coming due, and you don't have the money. Caldwell knows it too, which is why he's confident he can pressure you into selling for less than the land is worth." Margaret stared at him, unsure whether to be impressed or alarmed by how much he knew. "If you know I don't have money, why are you asking for $500? "Because that's what the job is worth. And because I believe you'll find a way to pay it." "I don't understand." Jake leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "You're Samuel Whitmore's daughter. He didn't raise a quitter, and neither did your mother from what I've heard. You'll find a way because giving up isn't in your nature." Margaret felt a surge of anger at his presumption. "You don't know anything about my nature, Mr. Sullivan. You don't know me at all." "I know you're still here," Jake said calmly. "Most women in your position would have sold out and moved back east to live with relatives. But you're still here, which tells me you're willing to fight for what's yours." "Fighting and winning are 2 different things." "They are. But you can't win if you don't fight." Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the land her grandfather had claimed and her father had built into something magnificent. The thought of losing it to Victor Caldwell made her stomach turn. The man was a bully who had accumulated his vast holdings through intimidation and underhanded deals. He treated his workers like slaves and his neighbors like obstacles to be removed. "What exactly would you do for this $500? She asked without turning around. "Whatever needs doing. Caldwell's been testing you, seeing how far he can push before you break. He's had his men cutting your fences, driving off your cattle, making it clear you're not welcome on your own land. That stops now. And if he escalates things? Then, things get escalated." Margaret turned around to study Jake's face. There was no boasting in his expression, no false bravado. Just a quiet confidence that suggested he had dealt with men like Caldwell before. "What makes you think you can handle Caldwell and his men? He's got at least a dozen writers on his payroll. I've handled worse odds." That's not really an answer. Jake finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully. "Miss Whitmore, there are some things a man can explain and some things he just has to prove. If you want references, I can give you names of people who'll vouch for me. If you want guarantees, I can't help you. But if you want Victor Caldwell to learn that the Whitmore ranch isn't his for the taking, then we can do business." Margaret studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or false confidence. She found neither. What she did find was something she hadn't seen in months: hope. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Jake stood up and put his hat back on. "Fair enough. But don't think too long. Every day you wait is another day Caldwell gets more comfortable thinking this place is already his." He walked toward the front door, and Margaret followed. As they reached the porch, Jake turned back to her. "One more thing, Miss Whitmore. When you decide to hire me, and I believe you will, there's something you need to understand. I don't take orders from clients. I take their money and I solve their problems, but I do it my way. If that's not acceptable to you, then we should part company now and save ourselves both some trouble." Margaret felt her temper flare. "This is my ranch, Mr. Sullivan. My problem. I'll be damned if I'm going to pay someone $500 and then have no say in how they handle things." Jake smiled for the first time since he had arrived, and Margaret was surprised by how it transformed his face. "Good. I was hoping you'd say something like that. A woman who doesn't fight for what's hers isn't worth working for." He touched his hat brim again and walked to his horse, a bay gelding that looked like it had some thoroughbred blood in its lines. As he mounted up, Margaret called out to him. "Mr. Sullivan, where will you be staying? In case I decide to take you up on your offer." "Charlie Torres said he'd rent me space above the livery. You can find me there." Jake rode away without looking back, leaving Margaret standing on her porch with more questions than answers. As she watched him disappear down the road, she realized she was already thinking of him as her salvation rather than just another problem to solve. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Margaret shaded her eyes against the morning sun and saw 3 riders coming up the road from the direction of the Caldwell ranch. Her stomach tightened as she recognized the lead rider. Tom Brennan, Caldwell's foreman, was a man with a reputation for violence that extended well beyond the county lines. Margaret quickly stepped back inside the house and retrieved her father's shotgun from the gun rack in his study. She had learned to shoot when she was 12, and her father had made sure she was as comfortable with a firearm as she was with a horse. But knowing how to shoot and being willing to kill were different things entirely. She returned to the porch as the 3 men rode into her yard. Tom Brennan was a big man with graying hair and scars on his face that spoke of a violent past. The 2 men with him were younger, probably hired guns rather than regular ranch hands. "Afternoon, Miss Whitmore," Brennan said, touching his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and mocking. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." "This is private property, Mr. Brennan. State your business or move on." Brennan's smile was unpleasant. "Now that's not very friendly. Your daddy would have invited us in for coffee. My father knew you were here on legitimate business. I have my doubts. Mr. Caldwell sent us to check on you. He's concerned about a woman trying to run a spread this size all by herself. Dangerous country for someone without proper protection." Margaret kept the shotgun pointed down but ready to raise if necessary. Tell Mr. Caldwell I appreciate his concern, but it's misplaced. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Are you now? Brennan looked around the yard, taking in the peeling paint on the barn and the broken gate that hadn't been repaired since her father's death. Property this size takes a lot of maintenance. Easy for things to get out of hand if you don't stay on top of them. It was a threat, barely disguised as concern. Margaret felt her anger rising but forced herself to stay calm. Losing her temper would only give Brennan the excuse he was probably looking for. I'm managing just fine, she said. Course you are. But if you ever decide you need help, or if you want to consider Mr. Caldwell's offer to buy this place, you just let us know. He's a generous man when it comes to helping his neighbors. I'll keep that in mind. Brendan's eyes lingered on the shotgun in her hands. You know how to use that thing, Miss Whitmore? Would you like a demonstration? The younger man to Brennan's left started to reach for his gun, but the foreman held up a hand to stop him. No need for hostility. We're all friends here. Friends don't make veiled threats on each other's property, Margaret said. Who's making threats? I'm just pointing out that accidents happen on ranches, fences get cut, cattle wander off, sometimes buildings catch fire. It's the nature of the business. Margaret raised the shotgun slightly, not quite pointing it at Brennan but making her intentions clear. And sometimes trespassers get shot. That's the nature of property ownership. Brennan's smile faded. You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Whitmore. This isn't the kind of country where a woman can afford to make enemies. Then, it's a good thing I'm not trying to make enemies. I'm just trying to make it clear that uninvited visitors aren't welcome here. The three men sat their horses in silence for a long moment. Margaret could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. Finally, Brennan touched his hat again. We'll be moving along then. You have a good day, Miss Whitmore. And remember what I said about accidents. They have a way of happening to people who aren't careful. The men turned their horses and rode away, but not before the youngest one spat in her yard, a deliberate insult that made Margaret's hands tighten on the shotgun. She stood on the porch until they were out of sight, then went back inside and barred the front door. As she replaced the shotgun in its rack, Margaret realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from anger. The nerve of those men, coming onto her property and threatening her in her own home. Her father would have run them off with a horsewhip. But her father was dead, and she was alone. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She could handle the financial problems, could figure out a way to deal with the bank. But she couldn't fight off Caldwell's men by herself, and she couldn't protect the ranch if they decided to escalate their intimidation tactics. Margaret walked back to her father's study and pulled out the bank letters again. $50,000. It might as well be $50 million, but Jake Sullivan was right about one thing. Giving up wasn't in her nature. She would find a way to save the ranch, and if that meant making a deal with a dangerous stranger, then so be it. She sat down at her father's desk and began writing a letter to the bank, asking for an extension on the loan payments. It was a long shot, but she had to try every avenue before committing to Jake Sullivan's offer. As she wrote, she found herself thinking about the mysterious cowboy who had appeared on her doorstep like an answer to a prayer she hadn't realized she was praying. There was something about Jake Sullivan that made her believe he could deliver on his promises. But there was also something that made her think he might be more dangerous than the men he was offering to protect her from. In her experience, men who were that confident usually had good reason to be, and those reasons weren't always pleasant to discover. Margaret waited 3 days before making her decision, 3 days during which Caldwell's men made their presence felt in increasingly bold ways. They cut the fence line along the eastern pasture, allowing 20 head of cattle to wander onto Caldwell's land. When Margaret rode over to retrieve them, she was told the cattle were considered payment for grazing fees. The next day, someone poisoned the water in the main trough near the house, killing 2 of her best horses. By the third night, Margaret had made up her mind. She saddled her mare in the pre-dawn darkness and rode to town, arriving at Charlie Torres's livery stable just as the sun was painting the eastern sky pink and gold. The old Mexican man was already up, mucking out stalls with the methodical patience of someone who had been doing the same work for 30 years. "Buenos dias, Miss Margaret," Charlie said, looking up from his work. "You're up early today." "I need to speak with your guest, Charlie. The one staying upstairs." Charlie's weathered face creased into a knowing smile. "Ah, Senor Sullivan. I thought maybe you would come to see him. He's been expecting you, I think. Has he now?" Margaret felt a flash of annoyance at Jake's presumption, followed immediately by relief that he had waited for her decision instead of moving on. "See? He said you would come when you were ready. Said you were the kind of woman who had to come to her own conclusions in her own time." Margaret tied her horse to the hitching post and climbed the narrow stairs to the loft above the stable. The space had been converted into a simple room with a bed, a chair, and a small table. Jake was sitting on the edge of the bed, cleaning his revolver with practiced efficiency. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway but didn't seem surprised to see her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, continuing to work on his gun. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Were you?" Margaret stepped into the room, noting how neat and orderly everything was despite the Spartan conditions. "That's quite an assumption." "Not an assumption. Charlie told me about the poisoned water and the missing cattle. A woman with any sense would realize she needed help after that." Margaret felt her temper rise again. A woman with any sense might also realize that hiring a stranger could be just as dangerous as dealing with the devil she knows. Jake finished cleaning his gun and slid it back into its holster. "You're absolutely right. Which is why you spent 3 days asking questions about me before coming here." It was true, though Margaret was surprised he knew it. She had indeed made inquiries, talking to the sheriff, the telegraph operator, and anyone else who might have heard of Jake Sullivan. What she had learned was both reassuring and troubling. "The sheriff says you used to be a Texas Ranger," she said, settling into the room's only chair. "Used to be," Jake confirmed. 5 years. Good job for a man who likes to travel and doesn't mind getting shot at occasionally. He also says you left the Rangers under unusual circumstances." Jake's expression didn't change, but Margaret noticed his hand drift unconsciously toward his gun. "Is that what he said? Unusual circumstances?" "He said there was some kind of incident involving a corrupt judge and a company of federal soldiers. Said you and your partner uncovered evidence of a conspiracy to steal land from Mexican families along the border." "Your sheriff talks too much. He says your partner was killed trying to bring the evidence to Austin. Says you disappeared after that, and the corrupt officials were quietly transferred to other posts without ever facing charges." Jake stood up and walked to the small window that overlooked the main street of Cedar Ridge. "Ancient history, Miss Whitmore. The past has a way of catching up with a man, but it doesn't change what he can do in the present." Margaret studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands had unconsciously formed fists. "The sheriff also mentioned that the judge who was taking bribes from the land grabbers was found dead in his hotel room about a week after your partner was killed. Natural causes, officially. Heart attack. Like I said, ancient history. A 40-year-old man with no history of heart problems doesn't usually die of natural causes." Jake turned to face her, and Margaret saw something cold and dangerous in his eyes. "Are you asking me if I killed him?" Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "I'm asking you if you're the kind of man who takes justice into his own hands when the law fails to provide it." "And if I am? Then, I need to know what I'm hiring. I need to know if you're a man who solves problems or creates them." Jake walked back to the bed and sat down, his hands resting on his knees. Judge Harrison was a corrupt piece of human refuse who sold justice to the highest bidder. My partner, Tom McNeil, was a good man with a wife and 2 young children. When Tom tried to expose Harrison's corruption, the judge had him killed and made it look like a robbery gone wrong. "So you took revenge?" "I made sure Harrison couldn't hurt anyone else. Whether you call that revenge or justice is up to you." Margaret absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the calm, controlled man in front of her with someone capable of cold-blooded murder. "Why are you telling me this?" Most men in your position would deny everything. Because you asked, and because you deserve to know who you're dealing with. I've killed men, Miss Whitmore. Some in the line of duty, some in self-defense, and at least one because the world was better off without him. If that's more than you bargained for, now would be a good time to walk away. Margaret considered his words carefully. She had asked the question, and she couldn't fault him for giving her an honest answer. The truth was, after 3 days of Caldwell's escalating harassment, she was less concerned with Jake's past sins than with his present capabilities. The sheriff also said you were one of the best gun hands he'd ever seen. Said you could outdraw any 3 men in the county and probably hit whatever you were aiming at while you were doing it. Jake's expression softened slightly. Sheriff Murphy was always generous with his praise. Is it true? I've never had cause to complain about my shooting. Margaret made her decision. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it on the table between them. There's $100 there. It's all I can spare right now, but I'll get you the rest of the $500 when this is over. Jake picked up the pouch and hefted it, feeling the weight of the coins inside. What makes you think it'll be over? Because you're going to make it over. You're going to convince Victor Caldwell that harassing me is more trouble than it's worth. And if he's not the type to be convinced, then you'll do whatever needs doing. That's what I'm paying you for. Jake stood up and extended his hand to Margaret. Then, we have a deal, Miss Whitmore. But I want you to understand something. Once this starts, there's no telling where it'll end. Caldwell's not going to back down easy, and when men like him get pushed, they tend to push back harder. Margaret shook his hand, surprised by the calluses on his palm and the strength of his grip. I understand the risks, Mr. Sullivan. The question is, do you understand what you're up against? Victor Caldwell isn't just some local bully. He's got connections in Dallas and Austin. Judges, politicians, maybe even federal marshals on his payroll. I've dealt with corrupt officials before. And look how that turned out for you. You ended up leaving the Rangers and living like a drifter. Jake smiled grimly. Maybe. But Judge Harrison ended up dead, and the land-grabbing operation got shut down. Sometimes a man has to decide what matters more, his career or his conscience. Margaret felt a chill at the matter-of-fact way he spoke about killing. She was beginning to realize that hiring Jake Sullivan might solve her immediate problems while creating entirely new ones. But she had made her choice, and backing out now would only leave her more vulnerable than before. When do you want to start? She asked. I already started. I've been watching Caldwell's men for the past 3 days, learning their routines and figuring out their weak points. Tonight, they're planning to do something to your windmill. Probably sabotage the pump mechanism so you'll lose water to the main pasture. Margaret felt her stomach clench. Without the windmill, she would lose her largest herd within a week. How do you know this? Because I followed them yesterday when they were scouting it. And because it's exactly what I would do if I wanted to force someone off their land without it looking like an outright attack. Can you stop them? Jake picked up his hat and settled it on his head. I can do better than that. I can make sure they regret the attempt. Margaret stood up, suddenly, uncertain about the path she had chosen. Mr. Sullivan, I want Caldwell's harassment to stop, but I don't want anyone killed unless it's absolutely necessary. Miss Whitmore, these men poisoned your horses and stole your cattle. They're not going to be deterred by a polite conversation and a firm handshake. Sometimes the only language men like that understand is violence. I understand that, but you're having second thoughts now that the talking is over and the real work is about to begin. Jake studied her face with those storm-gray eyes. That's natural. Most people can talk about fighting a lot easier than they can actually do it. Margaret felt her temper flare at his condescending tone. Don't lecture me about fighting, Mr. Sullivan. I've been fighting to keep this ranch together since my father died. I've dealt with banks and creditors and neighbors who think a woman has no business running a cattle operation. I know exactly what I'm up against. Do you? Because what you've been doing isn't fighting, Miss Whitmore. It's surviving. There's a difference. What's that supposed to mean? Jake moved closer to her, and Margaret caught the scent of leather and tobacco and something else, something dangerous and masculine that made her pulse quicken. It means you've been playing defense, trying to hold on to what you have. Tonight, we start playing offense. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something that both frightened and excited her. This was a man who had seen the worst of human nature and wasn't afraid to meet it on its own terms. He was exactly what she needed, and possibly exactly what she should avoid. Just promise me you'll try to resolve this without bloodshed if possible, she said. I promise I'll do whatever's necessary to protect your property and your interests. Beyond that, I can't make any guarantees. It wasn't the answer Margaret had hoped for, but it was probably the most honest one she was going to get. She nodded reluctantly and headed for the stairs. Miss Whitmore, Jake called after her. One more thing. After tonight, Caldwell's going to know you've hired help. He might decide to escalate things, maybe send more men or try a more direct approach. Are you prepared for that? Margaret paused on the stairs and looked back at him. Are you asking if I'm brave enough to see this through? I'm asking if you're committed enough to see this through. Bravery and commitment aren't the same thing. Margaret thought about her father's dream, about the land her grandfather had claimed and built into something lasting. She thought about Victor Caldwell and his assumption that she would crumble under pressure like any other helpless female. Most of all, she thought about what it would mean to lose everything her family had worked for because she was too afraid to fight for it. I'm committed, Mr. Sullivan. The question is whether you are. Jake touched the brim of his hat in that gesture she was beginning to recognize. I guess we'll both find out tonight. Margaret rode back to the ranch with her mind spinning. She had just hired a killer to protect her property, and, while part of her was relieved to finally have someone on her side, another part wondered if she had just made a deal with the devil. Jake Sullivan was clearly a dangerous man with a violent past, but he was also the only person who had been willing to help her when everyone else in the county was either afraid of Caldwell or hoping to profit from her downfall. As she approached the house, she saw Rosa hanging laundry on the line behind the kitchen. The older woman had been with the family for 15 years and had become more like a mother to Margaret than a servant. Rosa looked up as Margaret dismounted and immediately noticed her troubled expression. Mija, you look like you've seen a ghost, Rosa said in her heavily accented English. What troubles you this morning? I just hired a man to help us deal with our problems, Rosa. But I'm not sure if I made the right decision. Rosa set down her laundry basket and studied Margaret's face with the shrewd eyes of someone who had raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. This man, he is dangerous? Very. More dangerous than Senor Caldwell and his devils? Margaret considered the question. I don't know. Maybe. Rosa nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes, Mija, when you are being chased by wolves, you must find a bigger wolf to protect you. It is not safe, but it is better than being eaten. It was a crude analogy, but Margaret realized it captured her situation perfectly. She had hired Jake Sullivan not because she trusted him, but because she feared him less than she feared losing everything to Victor Caldwell. It was a calculated risk, and she could only hope she had calculated correctly. The rest of the day passed slowly. Margaret tried to keep busy with ranch work, but her mind kept drifting to what might happen when darkness fell. She found herself listening for gunshots and wondering if she would wake up to find bodies in her yard. The waiting was almost worse than the harassment had been. As sunset approached, Margaret positioned herself at her bedroom window with a pair of field glasses, watching the area around the windmill. She couldn't see much in the gathering darkness, but she knew Jake was out there somewhere, waiting for Caldwell's men to make their move. The attack came just after midnight. Margaret saw the flicker of torches in the distance and heard the sound of horses approaching the windmill. She held her breath, straining to see what was happening through the darkness. For long minutes, nothing seemed to occur. Then, she heard the sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed by shouting and the thunder of hoofbeats retreating toward the Caldwell ranch. Margaret waited until dawn before riding out to investigate, and what she found at the windmill made her stomach turn. Two of Caldwell's men lay sprawled in the dirt, both clearly dead. One had been shot through the chest, and the other appeared to have a broken neck. Jake Sullivan was nowhere to be seen, but there was no doubt about who was responsible for the carnage. As Margaret stared at the bodies, she realized that her quiet war with Victor Caldwell had just become something much more serious. Jake Sullivan had kept his promise to protect her property, but he had also guaranteed that there would be retaliation. The game had changed, and Margaret wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. Margaret stared at the two dead men until her stomach couldn't take it anymore, then turned away and retched into the grass. She had asked for protection, but she hadn't expected it to come with such brutal efficiency. The reality of what Jake Sullivan was capable of hit her like a physical blow, making her question everything about the decision she had made. The sound of approaching horses made her look up. 3 riders were coming from the direction of town, and Margaret recognized Sheriff Murphy's badge glinting in the morning sunlight. Behind him rode Deputy Willis and Dr. Hartwell, the town's physician and coroner. Word of the killings had apparently reached town faster than Margaret had expected. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," Sheriff Murphy said as he dismounted. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much violence over the years. "Heard there might be some trouble out here." "Good morning, Sheriff," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm afraid there's been an incident." Dr. Hartwell was already examining the bodies, his practiced eye taking in the details that would determine official cause of death. "This one was shot clean through the heart," he announced. "Professional work. The other one has a broken neck, probably from a fall or a blow." Sheriff Murphy walked around the scene, noting the scattered tools that Caldwell's men had brought to sabotage the windmill. "Looks like someone caught these boys in the act of vandalism and decided to take justice into their own hands." "That's one way to put it," Margaret said carefully. The sheriff fixed her with a sharp look. "Another way would be to say that someone murdered 2 men in cold blood. The question is, who had reason to want Caldwell's men dead?" Margaret felt her heart racing. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't prepared herself for how difficult it would be to lie to a man she had known since childhood. Sheriff Murphy had been a friend of her father's, and she respected him even if she didn't always agree with his methods. "I wouldn't know, Sheriff. I was asleep in the house. I only discovered the bodies this morning." "Is that so?" Murphy knelt beside one of the corpses and pointed to a boot print in the soft earth. "Whoever killed these men was wearing boots with distinctive heel marks. Mexican silver, most likely. Not the kind of thing you see on local ranch hands." Margaret's mouth went dry. She had noticed Jake's boots when he visited her house, had admired the ornate silver work on the heels. Now that craftsmanship might be the evidence that connected him to the murders. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description," she lied. Sheriff Murphy stood up and dusted off his knees. "Miss Whitmore, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Your father was one of the most honest men I ever met, and he raised you to be the same way. So I'm going to ask you one more time, do you know anything about these killings?" Margaret looked into the sheriff's eyes and saw genuine concern there, not just for justice but for her safety. Murphy knew as well as anyone that Victor Caldwell wouldn't let the death of his men go unanswered. The sheriff was trying to protect her, but Margaret also knew that admitting to hiring Jake would only make things worse for everyone involved. "I'm sorry, Sheriff, but I can't help you. I don't know who killed these men." Murphy sighed heavily. "All right. But I want you to understand something. Whoever did this has started a war, and wars have a way of claiming innocent victims. If you know something that could help me prevent more bloodshed, now would be the time to share it." "I wish I could help you," Margaret said, and she meant it. She was beginning to realize that her problems were only going to get worse before they got better. Dr. Hartwell finished his examination and approached the sheriff. "Best I can tell, both men died sometime around midnight. The shooting was close range, probably an ambush. The broken neck is harder to explain, but it looks like it might have been done with bare hands." Margaret suppressed a shudder. The idea of Jake Sullivan killing a man with his bare hands was somehow more disturbing than the clean efficiency of the gunshot. It suggested a level of violence that went beyond simple self-defense. "I'll need to notify the families," Sheriff Murphy said. "And I suppose I should pay a visit to Mr. Caldwell, though I doubt he'll be much help." "What will you tell him?" Margaret asked. "The truth. That two of his men were caught committing a crime on your property and someone killed them for it. Whether he chooses to see that as justice or murder is up to him." The sheriff and his party loaded the bodies onto a wagon and prepared to leave. As they were mounting up, Murphy turned back to Margaret one final time. "Miss Whitmore, I don't know what's going on here, but I can smell trouble coming like a storm front. If you're in some kind of danger, you need to let me help you. Don't try to handle this on your own." "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I can take care of myself." Murphy's expression was skeptical. "I hope so. Because after today, I don't think Victor Caldwell is going to be satisfied with petty harassment. This is going to escalate, and, when it does, innocent people are going to get hurt." After the sheriff left, Margaret walked slowly back to the house, her mind reeling from the morning's events. She had wanted Jake Sullivan to send a message to Caldwell, but she hadn't expected the message to be written in blood. Now she was an accessory to murder, and she had no idea how to deal with the consequences. Rosa met her at the kitchen door with a cup of coffee and a worried expression. "Mija, I heard the shooting last night. And I saw the sheriff leaving just now. What has happened?" Margaret sank into a chair at the kitchen table and buried her face in her hands. "Two men are dead, Rosa. The man I hired to protect us killed them." Rosa crossed herself and sat down across from Margaret. "Dios mío. Who were they?" "Caldwell's men. They came to sabotage the windmill, and Jake Sullivan stopped them." "This Jake Sullivan, he is the dangerous man you hired yesterday?" "Yes. And now I don't know what I've gotten us into." Rosa was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret's face with motherly concern. "Mija, sometimes when you make a deal with the devil, you get more than you bargained for. But sometimes it is the only way to survive." "I know. But I didn't expect it to be so." Margaret searched for the right word. "So brutal." "Violence is always brutal, child. That is why good people try to avoid it. But sometimes good people have no choice." Margaret looked up at Rosa, grateful for the older woman's steady presence. "Do you think I made the wrong decision?" "I think you made the only decision you could make. Now you must live with the consequences and pray that God forgives you for what was necessary." Margaret spent the rest of the morning trying to concentrate on ranch work, but her mind kept drifting to the image of the two dead men. She had never seen violent death before, and the reality of it was far more disturbing than she had imagined. By afternoon, she couldn't stand the waiting any longer and decided to ride to town to find Jake Sullivan. She found him at the saloon, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall and a clear view of both the front door and the rear exit. He was nursing a whiskey and reading a week-old newspaper, looking completely relaxed despite the fact that he was probably the most wanted man in 3 counties. Margaret approached his table cautiously, aware that every eye in the saloon was following her movements. It wasn't proper for a lady to be in such a place, but she was past caring about propriety. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly. "We need to talk." Jake looked up from his newspaper and gestured to the chair across from him. "I figured you'd be along sooner or later. Can I buy you a drink?" "I don't think that would be appropriate." "Probably not. But then, again, neither was hiring me in the first place, and you did that anyway." Margaret sat down reluctantly, acutely aware of the curious stares from the other patrons. "The sheriff came by this morning. He found the bodies. I assumed he would. Murphy's a good lawman. Thorough. He knows about your boots. The silver work on the heels left distinctive marks." Jake glanced down at his boots and shrugged. "Occupational hazard. Mexican craftsmen are artists, but they're not subtle. This isn't a joke, Mr. Sullivan. You killed 2 men last night. Jake's expression grew serious. I killed 2 men who were about to destroy your livelihood. And, if I hadn't stopped them, you'd be looking at dead cattle and a ruined ranch within a week. I understand that, but, you didn't expect it to be so messy. Jake finished his whiskey in one swallow. Miss Whitmore, you hired me to solve a problem that couldn't be solved with polite conversation. Did you think I was going to accomplish that by asking them nicely to leave you alone? Margaret felt her anger rising. I thought you might try to scare them off before resorting to murder. Murder? Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. Those men came onto your property in the dead of night with the intention of destroying your water supply. In Texas, that's grounds for a shooting, and any reasonable person would call it self-defense. You weren't defending yourself. You were lying in wait for them. I was protecting your property, which is what you hired me to do. Margaret stared at him, trying to reconcile the calm, reasonable man across from her with someone capable of cold-blooded killing. Did you have to kill both of them? Jake was silent for a long moment, and Margaret thought she saw something flicker across his face. Pain, maybe, or regret. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. The first one went for his gun when I confronted them. I didn't have a choice about that. The second one tried to run, but he stumbled and fell. When I went to check on him, he pulled a knife and tried to gut me. I broke his neck in self-defense. But they're both dead. Yes, they are. And, because they're dead, Caldwell knows you're not the helpless victim he thought you were. That was the point of the exercise. Margaret shook her head. I wanted him to know I wouldn't be intimidated. I didn't want to start a war. You didn't start this war, Miss Whitmore. Victor Caldwell did when he decided to steal your ranch. I just made it clear that you weren't going to surrender without a fight. Jake signaled the bartender for another whiskey, then leaned forward across the table. Let me explain something to you about men like Caldwell. They understand only one thing: superior force. Everything else, law, morality, common decency, is just noise to them. The only way to deal with a man like that is to convince him that the price of getting what he wants is higher than he's willing to pay. And, if he decides the price is worth paying, then, we make the price higher. Margaret felt a chill at the matter-of-fact way he talked about escalating violence. How many more people are going to die before this is over? That depends on how stubborn Caldwell is and how committed you are to keeping your ranch. I'm committed to keeping my ranch. I'm not committed to becoming a killer. Jake studied her face for a long moment. You're not a killer, Miss Whitmore. You're a survivor. And, sometimes survivors have to make choices that keep them awake at night. Before Margaret could respond, the saloon doors swung open and Tom Brennan walked in, followed by 3 other men she didn't recognize. The conversation in the room died instantly, and Margaret felt the tension ratchet up to a dangerous level. Brennan's eyes swept the room and settled on Margaret and Jake's table. His face was a mask of controlled rage, and Margaret noticed that his hand rested on the butt of his gun. Well, Brennan said loudly enough for everyone to hear. If it isn't the Whitmore widow and her new friend. Funny how trouble seems to follow certain people around. Jake slowly pushed back his chair and stood up, his movements careful and deliberate. Mr. Brennan, isn't it? I've heard a lot about you. Have you now? Brennan's 3 companions spread out slightly, positioning themselves to cover the exits. And, what exactly have you heard? That you're Victor Caldwell's chief enforcer. That you enjoy intimidating women and old men. That you're not quite as tough as you think you are. Margaret saw Brennan's face flush with anger, and she realized that Jake was deliberately provoking him. The smart thing to do would be to defuse the situation, but something in Jake's manner suggested he had a different plan in mind. You've got a smart mouth, stranger. Maybe it's time someone taught you some manners. Jake smiled, and Margaret was reminded of a wolf baring its teeth. I'm always willing to learn. What did you have in mind? Step outside, and I'll show you. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Margaret realized that everyone in the saloon was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Jake finished his whiskey and set the glass down carefully. "I'd be delighted," he said. As Jake moved toward the door, Margaret grabbed his arm. "Don't do this. It's exactly what Caldwell wants." Jake looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. "Miss Whitmore, some things can't be avoided. They can only be faced. If you kill him, you'll have every lawman in the state hunting you." "Only if I kill him unfairly." Margaret didn't understand what he meant until she followed the crowd of men outside and saw Jake removing his gun belt. He handed the weapon to the bartender and faced Brennan with nothing but his fists. "Fair enough for you?" Jake asked. Brennan's expression showed his confusion. He had obviously expected a gunfight, not a bare-knuckle brawl. But backing down now would destroy his reputation in front of witnesses, so he reluctantly unbuckled his own gun belt. The two men circled each other in the street while the crowd formed a loose circle around them. Margaret had never seen a real fight before, and she was unprepared for the vicious efficiency with which Jake dismantled Tom Brennan. The foreman was bigger and heavier, but Jake was faster and more skilled. He avoided Brennan's wild swings and methodically worked on the bigger man's body, landing sharp punches to the ribs and kidneys that gradually wore down his opponent's strength. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. It ended when Jake landed a devastating uppercut that lifted Brennan off his feet and sent him crashing to the ground, unconscious. Jake stood over the fallen man, breathing hard but not significantly injured. When he wakes up, Jake said to Brennan's companions, "Tell him this was a friendly conversation compared to what happens if he bothers Miss Whitmore again." The three men helped their unconscious leader to his feet and half-carried him toward their horses. As they rode out of town, Jake retrieved his gun belt and strapped it back on. "That was impressive," Margaret said quietly. "That was necessary," Jake corrected. "Brennan needed to learn that you're not without protection. Now maybe he'll think twice before making any more visits to your ranch." Margaret watched the dust cloud raised by Caldwell's men as they retreated toward their ranch. "Somehow I don't think this is over." Jake looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and nodded. "You're right. This is just the beginning. But at least now Caldwell knows he's in a fight." As they walked back toward the livery stable, Margaret realized that her quiet life was over. Jake Sullivan had protected her, but he had also made sure that there was no going back to the way things were. For better or worse, she was committed to this path now, and she could only hope she was strong enough to see it through to the end. The retaliation came 3 days later, swift and merciless. Margaret woke to the smell of smoke and the terrifying crackle of flames. She rushed to her bedroom window and saw that the main barn was ablaze, orange tongues of fire reaching toward the star-filled sky like desperate prayers. The horses inside were screaming in terror, their shrill cries cutting through the night air like knives. Margaret threw on her clothes and raced downstairs, grabbing a bucket from the kitchen as she ran toward the inferno. The heat hit her like a physical wall as she approached the burning structure, and she realized immediately that the building was beyond saving. Her only hope was to get the animals out before they burned alive. Rosa appeared at her side, coughing from the smoke but carrying another bucket. "Nija, it's too dangerous. The whole building will collapse soon." Margaret ignored her and ran toward the barn doors, which stood partially open. Through the gap, she could see her father's prize stallion, Thunder, rearing and striking at his stall door in panic. The magnificent black horse had been her father's pride and joy, worth more than most men made in a year. As Margaret reached for the door handle, a strong hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. Jake Sullivan stood behind her, his face grim and his clothes smelling of horse sweat and hard riding. "Where the hell were you?" Margaret shouted over the roar of the flames. "This is your fault. Caldwell did this because of what you did to his men." Jake didn't answer. Instead, he pushed past her and disappeared into the smoke-filled barn. Margaret heard him shouting commands to the horses, his voice calm and authoritative despite the chaos. One by one, he led the terrified animals to safety, his hands and voice somehow managing to calm them enough to follow him through the flames. Thunder was the last horse out, his black coat singed and his eyes rolling white with terror. Jake had thrown a wet blanket over the stallion's head to keep him from panicking, leading him by feel through the burning doorway just as the roof began to collapse. They all stood in the yard watching the barn burn, the flames now too high and too hot to fight effectively. Margaret counted the animals and felt a surge of relief when she realized they had saved them all. But the barn itself, along with tons of hay and feed, was a total loss. They used coal oil, Jake said quietly, examining scorch marks on the ground around the building. Poured it all around the foundation and lit it up. Professional job. Margaret felt tears of rage and frustration burning her eyes. How do you know it was Caldwell? Because this is exactly what I would do if I wanted to hurt someone financially without killing them outright. Burn the barn, destroy the feed, force you to spend money you don't have on rebuilding. But why not just kill me and be done with it? Jake looked at her with an expression that was both sympathetic and hard. Because dead martyrs sometimes bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. But a woman who goes bankrupt and has to sell her ranch? That's just business. Rosa approached them, her face streaked with soot and tears. Senor Jake, there is something you should know. I saw riders leaving after the fire started. 4 men heading toward the Caldwell ranch. Did you recognize any of them? One of them, I think it was Tom Brennan. Even in the darkness, I could tell by the way he sat his horse. Margaret felt a cold fury building in her chest. Brennan's humiliation in the street fight had obviously stung more than she had realized. This was his way of getting revenge while sending Caldwell's message at the same time. What do we do now? She asked Jake. Now we make them regret this decision. There was something in his voice that made Margaret look at him more carefully. In the flickering light of the dying fire, his face looked carved from stone, and his eyes held a coldness that reminded her of winter mornings when the frost killed everything it touched. Jake, what are you planning? I'm planning to explain to Mr. Caldwell and his men that burning down someone's barn is a serious crime in Texas. Sometimes it's even punishable by death. Margaret grabbed his arm as he started to walk away. You can't just ride over there and start shooting people. There are laws, even out here. Jake gently removed her hand from his arm. Miss Whitmore, the law is what happens when civilized people agree to settle their differences peacefully. When one side stops being civilized, the agreement is void. What about the sheriff? We should report this to Sheriff Murphy. And what would that accomplish? Murphy would ride out to the Caldwell ranch, Caldwell would deny everything, and nothing would change except that you'd be out a barn and several $1,000s worth of livestock feed. Margaret knew he was right, but the idea of Jake going after Caldwell's men alone terrified her. She had seen what he was capable of, but Caldwell had at least a dozen riders on his payroll, maybe more. You can't take on all of them by yourself. Jake smiled, and, for the first time since Margaret had known him, the expression reached his eyes. Miss Whitmore, I appreciate your concern, but I've been taking care of myself for a long time. Besides, I'm not planning to take them all on at once. What do you mean? I mean that wars are won by making the enemy afraid to leave his own territory. By tomorrow morning, Victor Caldwell is going to learn what it feels like to be the one under siege. Jake disappeared into the darkness, and Margaret was left standing in her yard with Rosa, watching the last of the barn burn down to smoldering embers. She had never felt so helpless or so angry in her entire life. The barn had been more than just a building. It represented her family's history, her father's hard work, and her own determination to carry on his legacy. Now it was gone, reduced to ash and blackened timbers. Rosa, help me move the horses to the north pasture, Margaret said finally. We'll need to build temporary shelters until we can afford to rebuild. See, Nija. But first, you should come inside and rest. There is nothing more we can do tonight. Margaret shook her head. I won't be able to sleep. Not after this. They spent the next several hours herding the horses to safety and making sure they had access to water. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed mocking after the night's destruction. As Margaret finally headed toward the house for coffee and a much-needed bath, she heard the sound of distant gunfire coming from the direction of the Caldwell ranch. 3 quick shots, then silence. Her stomach clenched with worry for Jake, but she forced herself to continue toward the house. Whatever was happening, she couldn't help him now. The gunfire continued sporadically throughout the morning, sometimes single shots and sometimes rapid volleys that sounded like pitched battles. Margaret found herself jumping at every sound, unable to concentrate on anything except wondering whether Jake was alive or dead. Around noon, Charlie Torres arrived from town with news that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Señorita Margaret, there has been much trouble at the Caldwell ranch. 3 of his men are dead, and his main bunkhouse burned down in the night." Margaret felt her legs go weak. "What about Jake Sullivan? No one has seen him since yesterday evening." "But Sheriff Murphy is asking questions, and he looks very unhappy." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them all turn toward the road. A single rider was coming toward the house at a steady pace, and Margaret's heart leaped when she recognized Jake's familiar silhouette. He looked like he had been through a war. His clothes were torn and stained with smoke and what looked like blood. His hat was gone, and there was a fresh cut on his forehead that had bled down into his eyes. But he was alive, and that was all Margaret cared about in the moment. Jake dismounted slowly, moving like someone whose body had been pushed to its limits. "Morning, Miss Whitmore. Sorry I'm late getting back." "Jake, are you all right? Charlie says there was trouble at the Caldwell ranch." "Some," Jake admitted. "But nothing that can't be handled." Margaret wanted to demand details, but something in his expression warned her that now was not the time for questions. Jake looked like a man who had seen and done things that would haunt his dreams for years to come. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the way he favored his left side. "Nothing serious. Brennan got lucky with a knife before I convinced him to stop fighting." "Tom Brennan is dead?" Jake nodded grimly. "Among others. Caldwell's going to have a hard time finding replacements for some of his better men." Margaret felt sick. She had known this would happen, had known that Jake's methods would lead to more bloodshed, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. "How many? Does it matter?" "They're the ones who started burning buildings in the night." "I just finished the conversation." Charlie Torres crossed himself and muttered a prayer in Spanish. Even Rosa, who had seen her share of violence in her younger days, looked shaken by the implications of what Jake had done. "The sheriff is asking questions," Margaret said quietly. "Charlie says he looks unhappy. Murphy's a good man, but he's caught between his duty to uphold the law and his understanding of how things really work out here. He knows Caldwell's been terrorizing his neighbors for years, but he also knows that vigilante justice sets a dangerous precedent. What happens if he decides to arrest you?" Jake shrugged, then winced as the movement aggravated his injured side. "Then, I'll have to decide whether I want to come along quietly or make things difficult for everyone involved." The casual way he talked about resisting arrest made Margaret realize once again just how dangerous Jake Sullivan really was. This wasn't a man who would be easily cowed by legal authority, especially when he believed his cause was just. "Jake, maybe you should leave town for a while. Let things cool down." "I'm not going anywhere until this business with Caldwell is settled." "And it's far from settled." Before Margaret could argue, the sound of multiple horses approaching made them all turn toward the road again. This time it was Sheriff Murphy, accompanied by 3 deputies and looking as grim as Margaret had ever seen him. The lawmen rode into the yard and dismounted, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Sheriff Murphy's eyes took in the destruction of the barn, then settled on Jake with unmistakable suspicion. "Mr. Sullivan, I presume," Murphy said. "I've been wanting to have a conversation with you." Jake stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between the sheriff and Margaret. "Sheriff, what can I do for you?" "You can start by explaining where you were last night between midnight and dawn." "I was dealing with some varmints that have been bothering Miss Whitmore's livestock. Sometimes predators need to be hunted down before they'll stop causing problems." Murphy's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw his jaw tighten. "Funny thing about that. Seems like someone was hunting predators over at the Caldwell Ranch around the same time. Left quite a mess behind. Is that so? Well, I've always heard that predators tend to run in packs. Maybe someone decided to track them back to their den. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, neither backing down. Margaret could feel the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm, and she realized that Jake was perfectly prepared to fight his way out if the sheriff tried to arrest him. Finally, Murphy sighed and shook his head. "Mr. Sullivan, I've got 3 dead men at the Caldwell Ranch and a barn that burned down for no apparent reason. I've got witnesses who saw riders leaving the scene, and I've got a town full of people who are scared that we're heading toward a range war. Now, I can either try to piece together what really happened and probably fail, or I can accept that sometimes justice takes forms that don't fit neatly into legal procedures." Jake remained silent, waiting to see which way the sheriff's decision would fall. "Here's what's going to happen," Murphy continued. "You're going to give me your word that the killing stops here, unless it's in clear self-defense. And Mr. Caldwell is going to be informed that any further harassment of Miss Whitmore will be considered a criminal matter that I'll handle personally." Margaret held her breath, waiting for Jake's response. Everything depended on whether he was willing to accept the sheriff's compromise or whether his desire for revenge would override his common sense. "That's acceptable to me, Sheriff," Jake said finally. "As long as Caldwell understands that self-defense includes protecting Miss Whitmore's property from arson and vandalism." Murphy nodded slowly. "I think we understand each other, Mr. Sullivan. Just remember that my patience has limits, and if this situation gets out of hand, I'll be forced to take action regardless of who started what." After the sheriff left, Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe normally again. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew that Jake's war with Caldwell was far from over. If anything, the destruction of the night before had raised the stakes to a level where someone was going to end up dead before it was finished. "Jake," she said quietly, "is it really over?" Jake looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and Margaret saw something there that she hadn't noticed before. Pain, yes, and weariness from the violence he had been forced to commit. But also something else, something that looked almost like regret. "No, Miss Whitmore. It's not over. Caldwell's too proud and too greedy to back down now. But, after last night, he knows the price of coming after you has gone up considerably. Maybe that'll be enough to make him reconsider his options." Margaret wanted to believe him, but she could see in his face that even Jake didn't think Caldwell would give up easily. The war for her ranch was entering a new phase, one where the only possible outcomes were total victory or total destruction. And Margaret was beginning to realize that she might lose everything, including her soul, before it was over. 3 weeks passed in an uneasy peace that felt more like the calm before a hurricane than any real resolution. Jake had taken up residence in the old foreman's cabin behind the main house, claiming he needed to stay close in case Caldwell tried anything else. Margaret told herself she agreed because it made strategic sense, but she couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened whenever she saw him working around the ranch. The man was an enigma wrapped in contradictions. She had seen him kill with ruthless efficiency, but she had also watched him spend an entire afternoon patiently gentling a spooked foal that had been injured in the barn fire. He could be harder than winter frost when dealing with threats, but he showed unexpected tenderness when he thought no one was looking. Margaret found herself making excuses to bring him coffee or check on repairs to the temporary horse shelters they had built. Each conversation revealed new layers to his character, glimpses of the man he might have been before violence became his profession. "You didn't always live like this," Margaret said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Before the Rangers, I mean." Jake was cleaning his revolver for the 3rd time that day, a nervous habit she had begun to recognize. "No. I grew up on a small ranch in South Texas. My father raised horses, mostly Mustangs he caught and broke himself. It was a good life, quiet and honest." "What changed?" Jake was silent for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were talking about events that had happened to someone else. "Comanche raid when I was 16. They hit us at dawn, burned everything, killed my parents and 2 younger brothers. I was out hunting deer and came back to find buzzards circling the house. Margaret felt her heart clench with sympathy. I'm so sorry. After that, I had nothing left except anger and a talent for violence. The Rangers seemed like a good way to put both to use while convincing myself I was serving justice instead of just seeking revenge. And, your partner, the one who was killed? Tom McNeil was the closest thing to family I had left. He believed in the law, thought it could be a force for good if decent men were willing to fight for it. When those corrupt bastards murdered him for trying to do the right thing, it broke something inside me that I don't think can be fixed. Margaret reached over and placed her hand over his, stopping the mechanical movements of cleaning the already spotless gun. Maybe it can be. Maybe you just need to find something worth fixing it for. Jake looked down at her hand on his, then up into her eyes. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities that both frightened and excited Margaret. She had never felt this way about any man, had never experienced the mixture of desire and tenderness that Jake Sullivan awakened in her. Before either of them could speak, the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Jake instantly shifted into alert mode, his hand moving to his gun while his eyes scanned the darkness beyond the porch light. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, rising from his chair. But the rider who emerged from the darkness was Charlie Torres, and his expression was one of excitement rather than alarm. "Senor Jake, Senorita Margaret, I have news. Victor Caldwell, he has left the territory. Packed up yesterday and took the